So, Derek, your mom told me that you did the experiment that our guest suggests people do in this episode of Protecting the Planet with Your Kids. What was it like? What did you hear?
I heard... So, the worm was really cool. It was like... against the paper. And I felt like it's going to crawl into my ear. And I was petrified. I was so scared.
To find out what it was that thrilled and terrified Derek, be sure to listen to this entire episode of Protecting the Planet with Your Kids here on Reading with Your Kids. Hola, niha, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni moli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedlie, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts, part of the beautiful planet Earth. And to celebrate Earth and all its beauty, we've created a special series of episodes called Protecting the Planet with Your Kids. Here to tell us all about it is my co-host and co-producer, Alexia Brown.
Hello, my name is Alexia Brown, and I am passionate about learning about how to best help our Earth and helping others learn with me. I know that it can be frustrating and sometimes a bit scary to sift through all of the information in our changing world, so I am bringing on experts on the topic onto the podcast for a fun new series, Protecting the Planet with Your Kids.
Alexia, I just love this idea. You are absolutely right. It is so important for us to talk with our kids about protecting the planet, but it's really, really difficult. I know you've lined up some fantastic authors for this series. Who are we going to be meeting today?
For today's super special episode, we are here with Jodi Wheeler-Toppen, who is the author of This is a Book to Read with a Worm. We talk about a ton of really cool facts about worms and the importance of learning and talking about nature with your kids. I even found out Jodi's favorite type of worm, and we've all shared 2 really fun crafts to do with a worm. I can't wait for all of you to listen.
I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me today. This is very exciting.
Jodi, it's great to have you back on. I didn't know you wrote a book called This is a Book to Read with a Worm. That is so cool.
You know, the whole book came to me with the title. I have done a lot of activities with worms with kids over the years. It's been a great hit in lots of different settings. And I just suddenly had this vision of a book. This is a book to read with a worm that would help walk kids through a bunch of fun things that they could do to get to know the worms that they're already finding and playing with on the playground.
Yeah, so tell us about the story. Just kind of what are some of the highlights of this book?
Well, the art, and Margaret did a fantastic job with the art, shows a little boy and a little girl as they are getting to know a worm that they found. And initially, the little boy is hesitant and the little girl is very excited, but over the course of the book, you can see that the boy gets more and more entranced with what's happening with the worm. The text itself is actually talking to the reader of the book and talking to them about things to do with their worm. And so it starts out saying, to read this book, you will need a worm. And it tells how to find a worm. And you go and you find a worm and you bring it back and you begin to do the things that are described in the book.
I guess kids should probably make sure it's okay with their moms and dads before they bring the worm into the house.
Yes. And in fact, this was an issue when we were talking about how the images should look. The images show children outside with their worm instead of inside with their worm, even though I regularly have worms all over my kitchen table.
Yeah, I was gonna say, when I was growing up, I was a worm kid. I loved worms. I would go outside with like a huge bucket into my mom's garden, dig up all the worms, and she'd be like, well, how is my garden gonna grow without any worms in it? They're so important. You're taking them all away.
Yes, and worms can play a really important role. This is something that was recognized way back in the 17 and 1800s that worms could be really important for agriculture. Something that we're now learning is that worms are so good at chewing up the material that falls into the environment and changing it into nutrients in the soil, that when they get in places where they haven't been in the past, that they actually cause problems because they digest all this material that has been laying around and is part of that ecosystem and are actually significantly changing ecosystems in places where they don't belong.
What?
Oh,
so
wow.
I just have to make sure I understand this. We're not just talking about worms like pulling out a worm magic wand and then transforming stuff into something else.
No, they eat it. They pull, so they have instead of a mouth, if you hold a worm up and you look at it really closely, it doesn't have a face like we would expect a face to look. But it does have a hole that you can see, and that hole is the mouth. And sometimes some of the worms that are really cool actually turn their little mouth kind of inside out and poke it through that hole so it looks like the worm is sticking its tongue out at you, but it's really not. It's really like sticking its stomach out to try to grab some leaf bits and things and pull it back in to its stomach. And then over the course of it going through the digestive system, it breaks down into nutrients.
That's really, really cool. I never picked up a worm and looked in his face.
Well, you should. It's actually quite interesting. And of course they don't all stick their stomach out like that, but the ones that do are quite surprising. And there's so much you can get to see if you'll just pick up a worm and just spend some time really looking at it.
So do you think that worm play should be encouraged by parents?
Absolutely. And if you look at all of the major scientists and naturalists over history, they all drove their families crazy by having nature stuff all over the house. I think there is something in this drive to hold and treasure something that makes us then an individual thing like a worm or a shell or a rock or a cool leaf that as we grow up makes us value and want to protect the entire environment.
Yeah, just that curiosity of the world around you like fosters such like an interest in everything. Yeah.
There's another picture book I really like. I believe it's called What's in Your Pocket, that tells the story of lots of different scientists and naturalists and the various things that they brought home with them as children. And it's by Heather Montgomery. It's an excellent picture book.
So you mentioned that worms are like natural composters, basically. Why is that so important for our Earth?
Well, if you have a pile of leaves after fall and you've raked your leaves or you've left them in a layer on the yard, over time, very slowly, bacteria or fungus or things like that will gradually use those leaves and things for food and and gradually put those nutrients back into the soil. Worms do it faster. And so they can be really important for agriculture because you want that soil to be good and full of nutrients for the plants to grow in by the next season. And so the worms can do it very quickly and get that good nutrition that's in those leaves back into a form that plants can use.
So do you think without worms, like we would be able to just compost on our own?
Well, we could. I mean, there are certainly other organisms that are able to break food down into nutrients that plants can use, like bacteria and fungus and things like that. But in the places where worms belong, they are the most efficient at doing that. And the natural state of the environment is for them to be an important part of turning over the nutrients so that they're ready for the next round of growing.
Mm-hmm. I know some kids are going to be naturally drawn to kind of learning about all of this kind of stuff and playing in the world around them and playing with worms and dirt and growing things and everything like that. But some kids just kind of aren't into that kind of stuff.
as a parent, how would you recommend that other parents go about kind of trying to inspire their own kids and get their own kids out there and like exploring the world around them?
Well, I think that it starts young and it starts small with the things that a child sees on a day-to-day basis. And so just pointing out when they're young, oh, look, that's a pretty flower. Because the same child who might not be excited about worms might be interested in seashells or in unusual rocks or usual rocks. I mean, your everyday rocks and your everyday things that you see around you can spark curiosity and interest, even if the worm isn't the way to go for that particular child.
So that sounds like great advice. If a kid doesn't like vanilla ice cream, they might like chocolate ice cream. But the point is to get, I don't know if you need to work to get kids to like ice cream, but is that kind of like what you're talking about, Jodi?
Yeah, just let the child find the part of nature that speaks to them. And it's going to vary from kid to kid. My son, when he was just a toddler, loved birds. And wherever we went, he would look for birds outside. If we went to the pet store, he would stare at the birds in the bird cages at the pet store and even chase the other children off who might come by to look because these were his birds. And so birds were the thing that he really related to. And so we followed that. And so I got him books on birds.
Wow. So our world is obviously changing quite rapidly, and that can be a really scary thing, especially as your kid is delving into this curiosity of the world and the nature around them. But how would you, as a parent, kind of go about bringing up climate change? And is that important to talk about with your kids as well?
I think it can be important. I also think it's important that we do it very carefully, because kids can get inundated with bad news. And it can feel overwhelming, and it can feel frightening, and it can make them feel powerless. And so I think it's very important that as we talk about this is changing, these are things we can do to help, is an important message, and that there are other people also working to solve this problem is an important message, because we don't want kids to grow up feeling like the weight of saving the world is on their shoulders.
But just making sure that they are aware of like things that they can do to help and things that are better for the environment is a good way to go about it.
Yes, and times when maybe you're choosing to walk somewhere instead of drive, and the child is a little grumpy because maybe they'd like to be driven to school today when normally they walk. And you can remind them, hey, this is a great thing that we can do to help make choices that protect the earth.
Do you think that gives kids a sense of empowerment when when you're working with your kid to compost or taking those extra steps instead of driving, that kids can grow up with this sense of, hey, I can, what I do matters to the world?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's important that we balance this. Here are steps you can take and things that you can do that really matter. And also, it's not all on you. That this is a problem that all of us are working to solve together.
Yeah, I feel like the sense of community surrounding it all is super important, like getting a group of kids and going to do something, and it's not like all on you. It's for all of us to do. Exactly.
I was just going to ask, Alexia and I both live in Boston, but we live in very different parts of Boston. It's wicked, as we say here in Boston, it's wicked easy for me to go outside and find worms in my beautiful big garden. But it might be a little bit more challenging for Alexia to find it because where she lives is much more urban. Are kids everywhere able to find worms and do stuff like composting, Jodi?
Most kids who are in the United States will be able to locate worms somewhere near where they live. The nice thing about even urban environments tend to have little pockets of places, even like the place that looks like it's just some dirt and weeds over next to the side of a broken sidewalk or something like that. Oftentimes there'll be worms located in that patch of soil. And certainly in parks and things like that. The place that kids may have the hardest time finding worms are actually in the part of the United States where worms don't have not historically lived, which is up kind of Wisconsin, up north around the Great Lakes. Those are some places where worms are moving in from fishermen bringing them in, but it's a little harder to find them in nature there, and that's where a bait shop can come in handy.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that there weren't just like worms everywhere. That's crazy.
I wasn't aware of that either when I first started researching this book, and I was astounded to learn that there's a place in the north part of the United States where back the last time we had big glaciers, that there were glaciers covering that part of, and worms couldn't live where there were glaciers, and so that portion of the United States has not naturally had earthworms.
Wow, that is insane.
It's amazing what you learn on this show, huh, Alexia?
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm learning so many facts about worms. Do you have a favorite fact about worms?
Well, I have a favorite worm. There is a giant worm in Australia that is, I want to say it's 6 to 10 feet long, and it lives down under the earth. And supposedly they say that farmers can sometimes hear the worms moving through the earth. And if I ever get to go, I will definitely want to go and try to hear, if I ever get to go to Australia, go where I can hear the giant gypsumland earthworms.
Wow. I don't know if that would be my favorite worm. That kind of sounds terrifying to me.
Well, apparently they are very, very shy and do not care to come to the surface at all. And there's only been a few of them that have been kind of recovered in, one piece.
Okay, so we don't need to be scared of the Australian worms.
No. It's happily doing its thing down under the earth and does not want to come to the surface.
Ah, so the worm is down under, down under.
Yes, it is.
Well, you mentioned that you have a favorite type of worm. Are there a bunch of different species of worms?
Oh, there's thousands and thousands, and probably many more that haven't been identified yet. Just recently, in the last few years, they found a new one in the Philippines that's called the fried egg worm that I recommend everyone look up online because it has a sort of blue skin with a pattern that looks like a fried egg on it in yellow and white. And there are all manner of earthworms all over the world, probably several hundred species just in my neighborhood. And many of them probably haven't been identified yet.
Oh my goodness. Do they all do the same role in each environment?
No, actually. Scientists group them roughly into 3 groups of environmental roles. One tends to work to primarily the sort of thing that I've been talking about of digesting the leaves that are on the surface. Some that tend to be smaller and are digesting things around the edges of plant roots, and some that are the deep liver that live deep in the earth, and they may come up to the top like the giant gypsum earthworm that I was just talking about. They may come up closer to the surface to get some leaves and bring them back down, but they're primarily living deep in the earth.
Wow, they all have different jobs that kind of help our soil be the best that they can.
Absolutely.
That is wonderful.
I'm really excited, Jodi, because, it sounds like the parents that are listening to this show can take the information that you're sharing with us and can take your book and really help make their kids aware of nature around them. And that is such an important thing for a parent to do. And it's so much fun to do, too.
Absolutely. When I was like Alexia growing up, and when I went out in the yard and was looking for worms, it felt like a treasure hunt. It felt like here was this living thing. I could have a pet for an hour that I could just go out and find, and it was a treasure. And I want to recapture that capture that in the book for as many kids as possible.
Yeah, and there's so much you can do with worms. You can kind of compare the sizes of them and how they look and how wide they are and how skinny they are, and there's just so much.
And you can even listen to the worm. one of the things it talks about in the book is that worms crawl, and the book has kids watch closely as the worms crawl and see the movement that it does. And they use some tiny hair-like structures called sepia that stick out of the body, and they kind of use them to anchor themselves in the dirt and pull themselves forward, and then stretch out and anchor themselves in the dirt and pull themselves forward. And we can't see those with our eyes most of the time. Sometimes if you get a good look with a hand lens, or you can see it. But if you roll a piece of paper into a cone, like you're making one of those old-fashioned hearing aid things, like from the 1800s, where somebody would hold it up to their ear and somebody would yell into it, and you set a worm in there on the paper and it wiggles, you can hear the hairs scratching against the paper, trying to get a hold so it can keep moving.
Wow, that is so interesting. I wish I knew that when I was a kid and I was experimenting with worms. I'm going to have to go out and find my own worm once the weather gets warm enough and try that out.
Well, there are so many activities like that you can do with a worm that just really help you understand better how the worm fits into its environment. And that's what I want to do in the book. I've used these activities with tons of kids across. And when I say tons of kids, I mean high schoolers, all the way down to elementary schoolers. I regularly would bring them to librarian conferences and have a bunch of librarians squealing over worms in the conference room. There's so much about worms that you can do and learn that people aren't aware of.
So if we want to do experiments with worms, which, I mean, I sure know after this I'm going to want to do an experiment with worms, but we want to make sure the worms are protected and we're treating them with care, what are some of the ways that we should go about handling worms?
Well, worms breathe through their skin. We have lungs, we go, and we bring air in and let air out. Well, with worms, it actually happens with the oxygen itself moving through their skin. And so their skin is very thin, and their skin has to stay wet because that's part of helping the oxygen get through. And so the first thing we want to do is make sure that we keep the worm in a damp place. So wet a paper towel and put your worm on the damp paper towel so that it always has some moisture around it. And then you can study it as it moves around on the paper towel. It's also a good idea to wash your hands before you handle the worm so that you don't have any lotion that's on your hands that might bother them. And in particular, right now we're all using a lot of hand sanitizer. And hand sanitizer has alcohol in it, which is very, it's painful for a worm. And so we don't want to get that on their skin.
Definitely, definitely. So I know that we kind of prepared an activity to go over in depth that you talk about, and it is super interesting to me, and I can't wait to try it, and hopefully a lot of our listeners are able to try it. Would you like to go over that activity?
Sure. This is one of the most fun things that I do when I'm in situations where I'm handing out worms and we're doing worm activities, because it is so fun to watch people's eyes light up. If you take a plastic bag, just like a plastic sandwich bag, and you can drop the worm in there, don't seal it, you're not taking the worm for lunch, and then you get a flashlight. And what you want to do is you want to hold the bag up in front of your face, and you want to hold the flashlight on the back side of the bag so that the light is actually heading towards your face. And you're going to turn on the light, and it's going to light up the worm from the back. And worms, even the ones that have quite a bit of coloring on the outside, are translucent enough that the light will go through, and you'll be able to see the digestive system. And so you can actually see that where they've been eating leaves and dirt and things, and you can see it as it's moving through the digestive system of the worm. And if you watch for a long time, you'll eventually see a little bit of poop come out the other end, which is called castings, and that's what has all the nutrients.
Wow, so you can literally watch the composting process happening right in front of your eyes.
Absolutely, absolutely. I like to call it X-ray vision of a worm.
That is amazing. I've personally never gotten to do an X-ray before, and I feel like this is the perfect opportunity.
It's lots of fun, and it's just amazing that you can see this. And when you suddenly see the little intestines, it's kind of an amazing moment.
And I'm just sitting back here thinking about, we talk about reluctant readers here in the show and how we can inspire them. I imagine there might be a lot of reluctant scientists out there who I don't want to know about science. I want to play baseball. I want to play my video games. I have a feeling if a parent says, yo, do you want to watch a worm turn a leaf into poop right before your very eyes? That might get them hooked.
Yes, with all of my books, I like to think of them as gateways for reluctant readers who like science or cool, gross stuff to get drawn into reading, and avid readers who aren't so sure about the science to get drawn into science.
Yeah, I really relate to that. As a kid growing up, I was always the reader, loved reading. I was always excited to go to the library, but not necessarily excited about science time. But again, books like yours just brought me out and got me so interested in the world, and now I love science. So,
well, that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm hoping that books like This Is a Book to Read with a Worm will do.
Well, I know, Jodi, we've been talking today about This Is a Book to Read with a Worm, but I also know you have a bunch of other books. So where can folks go to find out more about you and find out more about your other books?
Well, they can search Jodi Wheeler-Toppen on any bookstore website, but also they can go to onceUponAScienceBook.com, which is my personal website. I try to post some extras that go with the books, and there's a book trailer for This Is a Book to Read with a Worm. There's information on my books on science experiments to do with your cat and science experiments to do with your dog and other interesting things that kids who love science will want to try out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Please be sure to join us for the next Protecting the Planet with Your Kids episode next Thursday. I want to thank all of the people who made today's episode possible. Of course, a huge thank you to our guest, Jodi Wheeler-Toppen, and another huge thank you to the Reading with Your Kids team, Alejandra Doherty and Fatima Khan. And please be sure to visit our website, protectingtheplanetwithyourkids.com.